Hey everyone, welcome to the Revillager podcast. This is our sixth session and ongoing live interview series as part of our Revillager Kickstarter, which is live now with just 4 days left to go. Today, we have the honor of talking to Nicky Wilks. Nicky is deeply committed to the cultivation of transformational environments wherever and whenever the opportunity may arise, and welcomes the growth that stems from a healthy challenge. He is a champion of social entrepreneurship and regenerative business enterprise, with strong trust in the resilience of natural systems and the power of human connection. He hosts a podcast, The Right Ways, and is the founder of Journeyman, camps, quests, and courses for boys focused on rites of passage. He's also launching his One Village initiative, which aims to widen the Journeyman work with boys to youth of all genders. So welcoming Nicky Wilks. Good to see you, brother.
Thanks for stewarding your vision here with One Villager. Super stoked for y'all.
Thanks, man. I'm just noticing, are you on, is your audio on the computer?
Let me check.
I'm getting a nice echo of my voice. Or a delay.
No, the audio's through my headphones.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm in kind of an echoey room though. Let me turn down your voice volume.
Let's try this. How about this?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Perfect. Nicky, we don't know each other super well, but we were connected through friends, and coming across your work is really inspiring. A lot of what you're doing are things that I've been dreaming about for a long time, and it feels like you've been in it for a long time. You're also a father of 3 kids, and so already there's that resonance of fathers trying to do the work and trying to revillage our families and our communities. For our audience that might not know too much about you either, I'd love to hear, what is Journeyman, this project that you've been working on for a while? What brought you to Journeyman?
Yeah, great question, and happy to share. Journeyman is a nonprofit organization based here where I live on Vashon Island in Washington State. And we've been around now, which actually feels kind of wild to say, for 7 years. Our org's mission is wound up in my intro and bio, but I like to say, even outside of that, really what we're creating and have created is a village for boys and young men to be seen, to be loved, and to be supported, really to create positive, healthy identities as people in the world. And a lot of our why and the reason we started our work was my best friend and I, Alex, who's my co-founder at Journeyman. We grew up together here on Vashon and had a pretty idyllic childhood, which is, I think, common for a lot of the young ones who grow up here. But adolescence was really rough. And the same constructs that make this place really amazing for young children, and I think why parents flock here to be in this life stage, those same constructs are really suffocating and difficult when we begin to differentiate and step into adolescence and young adulthood. And there's some concepts that I'll talk about later with, I think some of your distinctions between community and village that really provided a contrast. But through our experience growing up here, but then realizing a lot of the patterns of harm and struggle for young people, and in our case, that was looking at how boys and young men were harming themselves, harming others, and or just checking out from life, sometimes taking excessive risks, sometimes, and this is more common these days, taking no risks at all and just kind of checking out from all healthy challenge or the parts of life that make us feel alive. And it was 8 years ago, Alex and I were standing around a campfire, and we had been talking about youth mentorship and creating like a network of sorts to connect, positive role models with younger people, because our background was in youth development. He was a teacher at the time. I'd been a coach and human development guide for a while. And as we're standing around this campfire, one of our other friends shared that they had just heard of another youth suicide in our community. And it just felt, it was heartbreaking, but it also felt like ridiculously common. Like hearing the news again was like, oh, okay, it's another one. And it was that part that was the most alarming for me, was how familiar it felt to hear of another young life in our community lost, early. And my friend and I looked at each other, Alex and I looked at each other and just said, now's the time. It's time to stop talking about this and actually do what we can. So that next year, we'd been in kind of a soak it all in phase of our lives in terms of training and our own experience. But we decided to run our first quest after participating in our own rites of passage and getting amazing mentorship and training from folks who've been doing it a lot longer. And that was the seed for Journeyman. The year after that, we started mentoring groups in school. So these days, we're serving about 100 youth every week in circles, basically counsel in schools. And through those circles and relational spaces, we do a lot of character development, social emotional learning, and we have these conversations combined with experiential learning activities that allow us to visit topics that usually don't get a lot of airtime in our culture. Certainly not in schools, but often not even in families anymore. Talking about things like consent and boundaries, talking about death, talking about love, heartbreak, rejection, talking about the vision that we have for ourselves. And all of those things are visited through these series of themes and talking circles through the year, and are just an amazing support system embedded during the school day to meet youth where they're at a lot of the time. That's kind of a good example where I like to say we're sneakily putting elements of village inside of an existing institution and creating some of the supports that would have been very common and I would say normal in a village context, but are pretty rare today with our modern institutions. So yeah, we've been rocking for 7 years now. We have a staff of like 30 people, and we just finished our first camp of the season last weekend called Kindle, where we bring together parents and a child for 2 days of connection. A lot of it is like relational trust building, team building activities. And it's so sweet. And one of our staff, I just want to quote what he said because it was his first time staffing that camp. And he said, "This camp to me sums up what I imagine One Village represents." And you can see it on my shirt. One Village is our expansion of these rites of passage and mentoring experiences for youth of all genders. And it felt like that. I mean, we had one of our staff people, Laura, who's there with her 2-year-old and facilitating and totally part of that experience, like holding her kiddo and leading activities. And there's older kids and younger kids all like weaving throughout. And it just felt like such a sweet village experience for us all. Jasper, your audio is not coming through for me right now.
How about now?
Yes, got
it. Sweet.
Mm-hmm.
It's the wonders of live tech. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's really beautiful. I mean, a lot of those pieces you're speaking to are so divorced from our current cultural context. And I talked to a lot of parents. Like when I became a parent, I didn't have mentorship. I had a little bit of mentorship as a teenager, thank God, because I went to a camp, and so the camp that you're speaking of is like, yeah, that is one of the places that I found mentorship because first of all, I was getting out of the city and I was going into nature. And that was really important for us as city folk, just to reconnect with land. And then secondly, we're living in a little village, a little community where we're experiencing that for the first time. And then thirdly, we have counselors who are kind of there as mentors to help us through. And luckily, in the camp that I was a part of, it was actually run by the YMCA. There was this whole program called the RAG program, and it was essentially around doing these self-development challenges and working your way up the rags. They were colored, and you get a mentor, you pick your mentor, and then they coach you through the week, and you then do a ceremony to receive your rag, and you like instill this challenge that you've developed for yourself, and then you go back into the world and you keep that rag with you. And I still have my rags hanging here as reminders of like, this is the challenge I made for myself. And now all the mentors that mentored me through these rags, I can call them up and connect with them. And so that was like a huge blessing for me. But most kids don't have that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And also most parents don't have that. And so what I was realizing talking to so many parents was there's the struggles of parenthood on every level. But it seemed like across the board, when kids got to teenage years, there was a breakdown. A breakdown of trust, a breakdown of relationship. And for the most part, parents couldn't figure it out. And in a sense, there was kind of this malaise of like, oh, that's just what happens. Teenagers just hate you. And like, I get that in the sense that they're individuating and they're rebelling. And I felt like there was something really off about that. You know, this breakdown of the relationship between the parent and the kid. And I think from what I understand, just from reading a lot of like attachment theory stuff, is, you know, when the kid and the parents don't have the secure attachment young, and then they become a teenager and they start wanting to experiment and rebel, and then they start keeping it all secret. And they stop communicating with their parents, and then their parents find out that they're doing a drug or something like that, and they freak out, and then that further breaks the relationship. And so I wonder, you know, what has your experience been like with parents kind of coming into this new, or families and kids coming to this new? Like, obviously there can be these big, you know, breaking open moments of real clarity and beauty, and I'm sure healing. And I imagine it's also hard and uncomfortable for a lot of families coming in. I'm just curious, like, what's the range been like for your work with families?
Yeah, that's such a good question. It's almost for me a heartbreaking realization that the real challenges and conflict that shows up in adolescence and early adulthood between parents and their children are, you know, those are the fruits of seeds that were planted in very early childhood. And like you said, those early years of forming a secure attachment. And it's not to say hope is lost, but I would say the emphasis that we put, particularly on these earlier experiences, is to strengthen that core relationship so that it can be a foundation through these later stages of differentiation, when children and young people naturally want to separate from their parents, but doing that from a place of like readiness and confidence instead of like fear and or how I might put it, as like dissatisfaction. But we get a huge range of parents, and sometimes parents will sign their kids up for things, and I get to have a convo with them. It's one of my favorite things to do, is like have these conversations during enrollment. And I have this sense for a lot of parents, I'm like, dang, like you are super aware of where your kiddo's at and what they need. And some of them have already, like I know you've done, like created their own rites of passage experiences for their kids, and they just want to sign them up for things that we're doing because it sounds fun, complimentary, and like it's going to reinforce what they're already doing. And in those cases, I'm like, awesome, right? There's a lot of beautiful relational foundation already present. And those are dynamics where I feel like when we send those young folks home, they're going to be in a context that's also very supportive and holding for that. And there's other situations that honestly are much more difficult. And, you know, sometimes we get parents who I think either subconsciously or maybe very intentionally want us to kind of fix their kid. And they send them to our camp, which might be 4 days or 9 or 10 days, and have this really high bar of like, yeah, when they come home, I want them to like treat me with respect and like do more chores around the house and like be an adult. But really, like what I feel in those situations is like, really what is expected is you want them to be compliant. You want them to be convenient in your life and your
Mm.
construct of what adulthood is, but ultimately fit within your paradigm. And one of the things that I feel like I've continually been reminded of, sometimes from mentors in this work of my own, uh, and I actually just had this reminder come through in a conversation last month with Michael Mead. If we're really doing rites of passage work, we are preparing people to enter a stage of wild mystery, which
Mm.
is extremely unsettling. And for a parent to realize that and then send their child or really participate in an initiatory rite of passage is to say, I'm fully ready for a total upheaval and unraveling of this person and what they mean to me. And
Mm.
that's not really what parents want most of the time. They don't really want that, I would say, true sense of differentiation, which is I'm willing to let go of all of the relationships in my life to really find out who I am. Um, that's a very, bold and risky move. So I'll say that for most of our experiences working with like older children, I'd say age 8 is about as young as we go for these parent-child camps, all the way up into the adolescent years, like puberty age. What we're really doing in our work is creating, preparing, I'll say, we're kind of doing preparatory work so that the later rite of passage is even possible. And so to me, I call it rites of passage work because it's like the preparatory pieces. But in many ways, we're simply like tending the soil. It's like we're cultivating the conditions for change to really be possible later, the healthy change.
Mm.
But 10 and 12-year-olds aren't, in our culture ready for true differentiation. They're not stepping into young adulthood yet. And in many ways, they're just figuring out some sentiment of a personal identity that is different from their family.
Mm.
As we get into like the later adolescence, early teen through late teen years, um, those are the experiences we're creating where we very intentionally are kind of creating some fire and creating some alchemical process to turn some things upside down and have our participants look at things critically and hopefully return back from the experience, willing to stand for what they believe in.
Mm.
And that creates conflict in a family. I've been on the phone or had conversations with parents who were really upset with how their teenager was behaving when they came home. And those to me are delicate conversations, but also signs, I would say, that the long-term process of initiation is taking place. And we have to trust that process and recognize that if we're really in it and there's the right supports present, right? Because it can't just happen in the family unit. I would say it also can't happen completely absent of the family unit. But if those systems can work together, we can hold enough of a container during that liminal time of transformation so that in 4 or 5 years, they can come through that journey and really have a grounded sense of self that's
Mm.
complementary to their family, and they can relate to it in a healthy way, but ultimately isn't dependent on it anymore. Um, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that piece around the wild mystery. I think I think there is this kind of presumption that a rite of passage is perhaps, or initiation is perhaps this goalpost that we pass and then we're
hmm
different.
hmm
And noticing that there are these consistent thresholds.
Yeah.
That's why it's like rites of passage. There's many. And in a lot of cultures I've studied, it seems like there's built in many of these throughout their life. Like
Yeah.
spending time in Bali, it was like I went to a rite of passage where the baby is placed on the ground for the first time at about a year and a half. They literally don't let them touch the ground
Wow.
until this rite of passage ceremony takes place, and then boom. And then at about 8 years old, they do this filing of the teeth, which is
hmm
their representation of coming from the animal into the spirit.
hmm
Anyways, they have so many ceremonies and rites of passage. But what I noticed growing up completely devoid of rites of passage, other than perhaps that camp I was speaking to,
Yeah.
was there just aren't the built-in systems for acknowledging the thresholds of change and development and maturity. And I hear a lot of people speaking to a very clear truth, which is most of the men in the world, even the men in power making decisions, are actually boys.
Yeah.
They never actually made the transition into manhood. Their adult body got older,
Yeah.
but their emotional maturity stayed in this space because they never had that growth and development. And the only thing I saw around me, because I lived with a lot of friends that were Jewish, were the bat mitzvahs and the bar
Yes.
mitzvahs, which were like, I went to a lot of them, and they were really cool. They were like, oh wow, there's this like ancient ceremony to bring you into manhood or bring you into womanhood. But it kind of ended there.
Yeah.
Most of my friends, it was like, this is just something I have to do, and then I forget about it. And I think that there's more and more conversation around rites of passage. I mean, my introduction really into it was through men's work, reading Iron John and like starting to understand this element of the individuation from the mother and from the father, and then reading about these kind of ancient tribes and cultures, which when the boy became a man, they would literally, like, the uncles of the village would come and take that boy away from the parents and
Yep.
put him through often really rigorous, very uncomfortable situations. Like you said, the fire, the alchemical breaking down of the character in order to kind of come from the ashes and build something new. And I guess something I just want to like get clear on from you is, why are rites of passage so important? Like, what are they actually doing to the individual, to the kid, the teenager? And why is it important for parents to think about this moving forwards in our culture, and wanting to, because there's so many every parent is doing their best. I really believe that.
Yeah.
And most parents I talk to want the best for their kid, and they want their kid to mature, and for lots of reasons. But why is it the rites of passage is worth focusing on, and what is that alchemical process in your opinion?
So good. I think rites of passage gives us a reliable, I want to say reliable tool set for facilitating belonging. And in so many ways, like the word and the image of village comes online for me in this conversation. Because if we look at the word passage, right, we can acknowledge that we're moving from one place into another. So that requires two different forms of awareness. The first one is, where am I? So that's kind of just a deeply informative question that allows us to be honest with ourselves. Where am I in my journey? Physically, I can look at place, but I like to look at our development across stages. And your example of like a lot of our men in leadership really being stuck in boy psychology is very true for me. That's something that I struggle with anytime I turn on political commentary or anything. I'm like, oh my gosh, like the way that these folks engage is very much from a childlike psychological process. And to start with that place of where am I in my journey is radically important, right? And then to also recognize what is next. Great. So now, by those two forms of awareness, we now have a recognition of where we are, a static place of being, and then where we imagine ourselves going. What's next for us? What's our vision? Or what do we feel our calling is? I love that language in rites of passage work. Like, do you feel the call? Do you feel a call, like from your soul or from higher power, whatever you want to call it, to initiate, to take a risk, to do something different? And when we hear that call or we feel that deep longing for something else, then there's the conditions for rites of passage work to come online. And that's the toolkit of facilitating that passage in a marking ceremony or in I want to say a rite, a ritual, so that a person and their psychological sense of self truly feels connected to the state in this other place. And when I think about what I think we were building with Revillager and what so many of the organizations that I'm connected to and working with these days are doing is creating a deep sense of connection and belonging to that stage of life. In order to do rites of passage work, in order to facilitate these experiences, there's also the requirement that we have healthy anchored adults and or healthy anchored elders at later stages of the process. And that full picture creates a village. And I think I get a lot of excitement out of this conversation because what we were talking about earlier with parents, right? And some of the challenges that I think a lot of our parents are experiencing, they'll say things like, I just don't know what he needs, or I don't know what my kid needs. I've tried everything. And because they haven't participated in a rite of passage, because they never had a village or a community around them who says, we see you, you're welcome here, you're one of us now, you've done, you've been through the rites, right? We acknowledge your place in this community and welcome. And because they never got that, they're like just so fragmented in trying to imagine what their young people need. And it's like, oh yeah, they need a community of people, a village of people, not just their parents, mentors, and in your example, uncles, aunties, grandparents, other people who are saying, we see you, and actually see them for who they are, not just blowing smoke or, affirming them with compliments about, hey, you're really great at sports, or I see you got an A on your report card, but really see into them, like into what we would call the gift, and can help to tease that out. And I think rites of passage gives us a reliable way to facilitate a sense of belonging to something that's bigger than us, but also affirms our place in that bigness and gives us a real sense of confidence that we matter. And that's powerful, potent medicine today, where so many people, young and old, youth I work with and adults, are feeling a great sense of dissatisfaction. They're feeling like purposeless or a lack of meaning, or they're doing all the right things supposedly, and they've reached success, and yet there's this void. There's this deep void within that's still present. And to me, that's a sign that we need village present, and we need a reliable way to welcome people into that village and make them feel affirmed in it.
Yeah, well said. I mean, the piece around belonging and welcoming and knowing your role is so huge, because we're kind of cast out into society like, okay, go figure out how you're going to contribute, or go figure out how you're going to make ends meet and feed your own kids. But there's not this like sense of I belong here. And even if you look at the deep foundational ideology of how we look at the planet, for the most part, it's very mechanistic. And it's very like, we're just this random blip that appeared here. Or even if you're spiritual and religious, there's still this element of like, you're here to be tested. Not necessarily you belong here and you're part of this big organism, and how do you give the most. And I like the wording of the gift. A lot of self-development, they talk about your purpose. And that's to me, that's a very difficult word. Because people are like, okay, well, my purpose, is it what I enjoy doing? Is it what I'm good at? Is it a mix of those things? Can I make money from my purpose, or does that kill my purpose? And I know a lot of disenfranchised teenagers, especially right now, who are just like, I don't want to do any of those things, and they're looking at the way things are being governed in the world and climate crisis, and they're just like, what's the point? It's very easy to be disheartened if you're paying attention right now. And I can see why also, you mentioned earlier about how childhood is so like, it's paradise in these natural rural environments. But then when you get to those kind of teenage years, and I feel like that is a moment where you really need the community to connect in your own way, find your belonging. And then suddenly it's like, there's nothing to really do or to expand on in those spaces. And I see that a lot. And it's something I'm thinking a lot about with my son, who's 10 now. And we moved him out of the city into a rural space. And it's like, it's incredible for him here. And I see that as he grows, like I'm going to need to help him find his own village and his own sense of
Yeah.
community and gift. And I guess in that sense, what does that look like in the modern day context if we're talking about people in cities and suburbs?
Yeah.
And I think it's really important what you said about, we have these rites of passage to bring us through these thresholds, but then we go back to our families or back to our world. And that's where the real work, in a sense, happens and the
Yeah.
real growth happens. And I wonder what you think about that in terms of modern day urban, suburban context. Like, obviously, if a family or parents can get their kids out to something like what you're doing, that's massively important. And then how do you find the integration happens back home, and how can we kind of foster this ethos of passage in a world where a lot of people are living, which is, full of brick and steel and apartment buildings and such?
Totally. That's a great question. Yeah, I think it's so important for us not to be ignorant to the reality that, not everyone either lives in a rural garden-like, eco village or something like that. But ultimately, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where people live. I think the structures and the imaginal beauty and medicine of village is available to everybody, no matter where we are. Um, I like to say that all of the work that we do is possible in a different context. It's just more difficult in my experience. And when we can bring a group, whether it's adults or young people, but bring them into the expanse of nature, or what we would call a nature-based setting, and the more close to true wild, I think the better, which is the absence of other humans, which removes us from culture and influence, but also gives us this very objective backdrop from which to look at things like our identity or the culture that we just came from. And nature is so honest, right? Sometimes I think about working with young people. There's always such a concern about fairness, and we play a lot of games, and they're like, "That wasn't fair," and I'm just like, "Yes, got it." Nature is very fair, I like to say, and so when we go into nature, we get to engage in these processes in a very honest, fair, objective backdrop, and then it gives us a clear reflection. I like to say it's the best mirror we have. That said, I am aware of amazing rites of passage organizations and even examples from families who have created symbolic processes for themselves and for young people to go through and still experience many of those same benefits. And what it requires, I like to say, is even more emphasis on the culture side, right? Those human elements and supports, and I'll say controls to ensure that safety and clarity of affect and where people want to go are still clear and instilled. Those things, I like to say, just take a little bit more work, or at least for me, because I'm very attuned to doing my side of the work in a natural context. But even to relay back on what we do in schools, what we're doing in schools is very much in the box, right? We're in a walled off room, and every single time we engage in the process, it takes our youth 10, at least 15 minutes to really settle into a different psycho-spiritual space. And I like to say that when we're doing that same process, but we're outside, it's boom, we're right in it. We don't have to facilitate the settle down of the bell system and all the noise and the things. So it's totally possible. I think it takes a little bit more, attention, a bit more work, certainly more preparatory experience. But as you mentioned, the return, and I wonder about the long-term benefits of taking folks, families, youth from a highly urban or even a suburban context that doesn't feel like one in which they belong, they don't feel safe, comfortable, they want to be there. But taking them out of that for 10 days and undergoing this deep transformative process with us or with another org, and then sending them back. Like I have huge questions about that, because in our model, right, we would call that return the integration phase or the incorporation phase. And as you mentioned, that's like where a lot of the work takes place. That's when it's hard. That's like when life and the universe and your family is like testing you in the claiming statement that you made of like, yeah, like I'm a healthy, compassionate young adult who loves myself and takes care of their people. If that's my grounding statement that I'm walking home with, and I go back into my family unit and they're all used to like the other me that they knew for the last 13 years or whatever, they're not going to just most of the time accept me and be like, oh, cool, we've been waiting for you. Welcome home. They're going to poke and jab, and those peers back at school are they're going to work so hard to keep people the way they knew them, because that is really the rubber band like tension of culture. And that last part of the process is the most difficult in a modern context, because we don't have the structures of village in place. That's when, like you said, having access to the mentor who's like, I could call you up anytime, that's when that matters. And we stay available to our young people in that phase, but we can't force them to call us. We can just say, I'm available anytime. Like, call me when you have that moment when you're doubting everything and wishing, you were somewhere else, or wishing you were dead and wanted to end it all. Those are the moments when you have to remember that you have support, and you can pick up the phone and call me or call another resource. And a lot of our young people do. And this week, I actually just got 2 text messages from guys that have done our quest over the past 7 years. One of them did it 4 years ago. One of them did it 5 years ago. And both of them texted me in the last week being like, hey, I'm coming back to the island for a little bit. I'd love to connect. And those moments to me are like glimpses of the light of like, yes, like that to me is so critical. But the other side of that is there's a lot of other ones who don't do that and who probably need it. And maybe they will in a year or two. I don't know. But I think it's so crucial that we don't pretend that the transformative constructs of rites of passage work can complete itself in 10 days, and that we don't need these embedded support systems present in the schools, in the family units, in whatever form of society are still available, because that's when we get tested. That's when the real challenge takes place. We might facilitate growth-oriented challenge during a ritual or in a ceremony or in this kind of liminal space, but that's emulating something that we are expecting to happen when they go home. And that to me is really the point of emphasis that I feel like I'm not able to achieve alone, or even our organization, but that I get really excited about what y'all are building and some of these larger conversations of just waking adults and more of us up to like, oh, maybe I could actually be more of a resource to young people, even if I don't have kids, even if I don't have teenagers, like even if I'm done with that stage of life. And that to me is a really fascinating part of village life that honestly inspired a lot of our origin story. Because when we got pregnant, and I think you and I were talking about our oldest are about the same age. So about 10 years ago, I was 24, and I was it was very much in my own initiatory journey at the time. Like, oh God, like I have to grow up. I'm still a child, like I'm not ready. And I like to say I was in like a 24-year-old psychological tantrum. But what I realized was like, crap, like I don't have any friends with kids. So that to me was scary. The other part was like, nobody seems to be engaging with youth except for like teachers and parents. But aside from that, no one in our society feels any responsibility to spend time in the lives of young people. And I thought, like, when I really looked at that, I was like, that's weird to me, because there's a part of like in my bones, I feel that all of us actually know how to engage with babies and children and young people. Like that's how we always were for all of our, who knows, millions of years probably of evolution. We were in these multi-generational societies. And now for the last couple hundred years, we've stratified that in this strange way where like the only people spending time with children are parents and then educators for the most part, or maybe
Mhm.
childcare folks too, right? But aside from that, we have this huge group of uh, adults who have wisdom and stories and even just relational capacity that is
Mhm.
not being utilized in any sort of meaningful way across the generations. And the result of that to me is one, a lot of adults are missing out on the inspirational beauty of young people. Like sometimes I describe them like, yeah, I work with a lot of youth, especially teen boys. And they're like, oh God, like there's like this repulsive emotion. And I'm like, really? Because they're amazing. And like being around them is so inspiring. And yeah, they're cheeky and they'll test you and they want to play games and they're really sarcastic a lot of the time, but they're not boring. They want to be challenged and engaged and they're going to keep you on your toes. It's
Mhm.
hard to not feel alive when you're around young people. And that is in my lineage and teaching, like that's the gift of young people, youthful, inspirational energy.
Mhm.
And when we have adults who are 30, 40, 50 years old being like, I'm just like lacking meaning and inspiration, like I don't know what life's all about. I'm like, oh my gosh, guess what? Go spend 4 days at one of our camps. I guarantee you will walk away from that feeling uplifted, inspired, hopeful for the future. You'll feel like you had a purpose, even though you were just hanging out for 4 days. All of those boxes get checked.
Mhm.
And on the flip side, our young people feel validated. They feel
Mhm.
like older people care about them, that they aren't just crotchety boomers who are, creating all the problems in the world. Um, but that bridge goes both ways. And we
Mhm.
had this quote that we were playing with for a while, which is the medicine in our work is bridging these generations and it's bringing the youthful inspirational energy from youth and it's passing down the grounded wisdom from our elders.
Mhm.
And that to me is really where I think a lot of our evolution of rites of passage work is coming online
Mhm.
and spanning those gaps, welcoming our elders into a vital role in village, but also bringing young people up in that same part of the process.
Yeah, there's a lot there I want to speak to. I mean, that last piece around the eldership and the children, to me, that's one of the key pieces we need to figure out for revillaging.
Mm-hmm.
Because, I looking at the ways intact villages and intact cultures work with the intergenerational, it's like it makes full sense. The kids and the elders are so good for each other.
So
Beginning of
good.
life, end of life. Not much to do, not much to do. Like they're
Yeah.
both so they love being around each other. Like luckily I got to live with my parents for a little while and like grandparents and grandkids, like perfect match,
So
and like
good.
our society again, like we don't live anywhere near our grandparents, a lot of people.
Yeah.
Um and elders are kind of shipped off into nursing homes and seen as not very useful for society, and children are kind of
Yeah.
not very useful for society, and adults, parents, nuclear families are like just stressed to the core trying to do
Yeah.
everything, when in a village the kids would have other kids, they'd have the elders to spend time with, the adults were off doing the important stuff of making sure there's food and making sure there's survival. Whereas those two, beginning and end of life spectrum could really just be,
Yeah.
and teach each other. And like the young kept the elders kind of youthful, and the elders brought the
Mm-hmm.
youth into their adulthood. So that like fabric, that social fabric is so important to reweave.
Yes.
So deeply nourishing to see it in action, which I'm sure you do. Um,
Yes.
and and then what you were speaking to around your own journey of parenthood, we must live pretty tandem lives, because I was also 24,
Mm-hmm.
had my existential tantrum, not prepared to be a dad at all, had no rites of passage to that point. Like I didn't feel like a man. It took me
Yep.
years. It took me years
Yep.
to like feel like a man and feel like a father.
Mm-hmm.
um and that's something I really try to reach out to with men in my community that are becoming dads, because there's
Yep.
often this, valid focus, but still like a kind of myopic focus on the mom.
Yes.
and fathers are often left out. It's just like, oh yeah, you'll just figure it out. It's
Hmm.
like it's intense to go from that shift of being this boy, or even if you've done some thresholds into manhood, to becoming a dad. And there's really not resources for dads as much, and there's not
Yep.
like that rite of passage into becoming a father, which is also a really important rite of passage. Um, so that's something I think about a lot, and wanting to give this to my own son, and like we did a rite of passage when he was 7, and trying to figure out what that looked like for me. Again, not having much mentorship in that way, I took from what I learned from various traditions, tried to bring it into some ancestral connection to our Celtic lineage, but also I modeled it off of Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey. So I kind
Hmm.
of broke down the ritual into the 19 phases, and kind of did a fun version of that, and had my friends come and do characters, and it was really
Cool.
special. And then I posted about it, and then so many people have messaged me being like, "Hey, I want to do a rite of passage. I have no idea where to start."
Mm. Yep.
And that's just something like I see you're filling that gap in a really important way.
Yep.
And uncles and aunties too, like what you shared there, like something I noticed becoming a dad was there's a lot of talk in the alternative communities around community.
Hmm.
But when you're a parent, you see very clearly the difference between people that really want to engage with kids and can engage with kids, and people that don't. And
Yep.
for all the talk of community, when it came down to who's going to watch my kid for a couple hours, most people wouldn't show up.
Yep.
It was rare that people show up. And a lot of the time people would show up, it'd be like they're doing a favor for the parents,
Hmm.
which is awesome. I'm super supportive of that. It is such a favor. Like anyone listening, go help
Right.
out a parent, spend an hour with their kids. It'll do that kid well, it'll do them well, and it'll save their parents, give them some time. So that's just
Hmm.
like an obvious. But some people who came into our lives, they weren't doing it for us.
Yeah.
They loved that child, and they saw the relationship there, and they were their friend. It
Yep.
wasn't about a service. It was like, I want to be a friend to this child. And like you said, it's so inspiring to hang out with kids, like their view of the world and their authenticity, and also the growth that they're going through, and how much we can offer that process just by sharing what we know. And so I constantly tell people that don't have kids, I'm like, hey, you don't have to have kids, because a lot of people are deciding not to.
Hmm.
That's fine. But then go be an auntie, go be an uncle, like
Yep.
go be a part of the village. And so I would love to know more from you about One Village, because it sounds like Journeyman was really focused on boys,
Hmm.
and it feels like you're expanding, and you're kind
Yep.
of, I'm curious about like what made you choose the One Village name, how you arrived at deciding to open it up to all genders, and what that project is looking like right now.
Yeah. Ah, such a fun question. Just to riff off something you said, I, I occasionally use this language with others, but I always say it to myself when I want to say when I'm glimpsing or witnessing adults getting that, like, their cup filled by spending time with young people. And it comes down to, like, there was a time in our human evolution where we actually viewed all children in our village as our children.
Mm,
It wasn't just like, that's my kid and
mhm,
thus not your responsibility.
mhm,
And sometimes I'll say out loud, I'll be like, someone will be like, oh, thank you so much for like helping my kid, and I'm like, yeah, they're all of our kids, right?
mhm,
And that mentality is fundamentally radical for a lot of people to hear. And sometimes they're kind of like, what did you just say? Right. And it's just like, I want to live. I'm not saying I live my life like that every moment, but that's where I want to be. I want to be behaving as which I have a responsibility for the well-being of this young person, simply because we're here now together.
mm,
Thus I'm choosing to be, I'm choosing to be in this person's village, and because of that, I also receive a tremendous gift of their light and their luminous presence in the world. um, yes. So why One Village? Kind of, where did this phase of our growth come from? um, Ever since we started, we had questions like, what about the girls? What about non-binary kids? Like, why are you focusing on boys? And our answers are clear then, just like they are now. Our lived experience as males, looking at waves of awareness through the Me Too movement and the need for like targeted supports on the pieces of masculinity and conditioning of what it means to be male that are just straight up garbage and hurtful and also not empowering. But also wanting to look at boys as a solution, right? Not as a problem. And so many of the institutions that we were connected to, probably subconsciously we're like, oh God, these boys are really hard to work with. They're 90% of the discipline referrals, and they're the ones that are violent and calling people names. But I like to say, particularly when children are acting out, they're revealing a problem of the culture. They're not just making our lives hard because they want to. They're like acting out because things aren't well. And one of my favorite questions that I can't trace it to a particular culture, but what I've been told is that it is a sign of wellness, or I'll say peace, is a greeting. And when someone comes back to the community, they can ask, how are the children? And it's a very quick way of saying, like, how is the whole village doing, really? Because if the children are thriving, then something is going right. And in our community, when we started, there was a huge need for boys, and that's, I'll say still an emphasis. But through that process, we had voices come up of being like, hey, how much of this is actually transferable and appropriate for youth of all genders? And the truth is, like, a lot of our lineage and training, whether it was like adult vision fasts or process work, coaching, you name it, wasn't gender specific. And so the answer was usually like, almost everything. What feels important is that we have representation and diversity in a staffing group or in our, I would say, adult community that mirrors the youth that we're working with. So if we're going to do this, like, we need to recruit and really hold adults in this space, and some of our guides and mentors and facilitators who have identities that will represent the youth that we'll ultimately bring in. And that was kind of a slow burn conversation for a while, because, as you know, starting something from scratch takes every ounce of us. And we were just like, yes, we are open to this, and we're going to continue to focus on our mission. And finally, we actually had a young person who had been through a rite of passage that we put on for 8th graders in our community, who like truly found themselves in this experience. And through their exploration of gender, came to feel really strongly that they wanted to carry the torch of sorts and be like, I want to be a key person so that we can open up circles that we're running for youth of all genders in the community. And they put together, this is the dopest thing ever. I was teaching entrepreneurship at the time. I taught at the high school for 5 years, and most of it was entrepreneurship, some marketing and leadership stuff sprinkled in. But they had taken my entrepreneurship class, and so they put together this pitch deck, like straight up pitch, right? And sat me down at, I think it was lunch, or maybe it was like after school, and they pitched me on their vision. And we're like, look, I've already thought of these. Here's where we can get staff. Here's where money can come from. And I was just like, yes. Oh my gosh, this is so inspiring and perfect. I was like, okay, great. Let's do it. And that sparked a series of conversations with our board, with other staff members who were already like highly engaged, but just kind of waiting for the expansion to take place. And we were sitting with language for a long time. And one of our shared friends and collaborators, Ian McKenzie, I recall in a previous podcast I had done with him, I had used the language like a village for young men. And ever since we started, right, we had resonated around this vision of village. And we would use the word at times ourselves. But I can trace it back actually to a dream that I had. And this was way before Journeyman even started. I was living in Costa Rica at the time. And I had this recurring dream that would come up. And this one was a really potent one. But in this dream, I wake up in the dream and I'm in a primitive village, and it's initiation night. And there's like a sound, like a faint sound of drumming off in the distance. And there's this energy in my body of like aliveness and like readiness, almost like get ready to go to battle, but not scary. Just like, it's a feeling that I came to learn was how I engaged in competitive sports for a long time. But that adrenaline is present. And I wake up and, and sometimes you wake up and you're 100% awake immediately. You're like, oh, I'm here. So it's that kind of a wake up. And then I go out of this hut and there's like all these people, right, kind of moving around stealthily in the night. And it's the beginning of an initiation ritual. And it's clearly a village context. Like that's the backdrop, right? And that dream came back many times over the few years previous to actually starting our work. But I always recalled that dream when people would ask, like, where's a lot of this inspiration coming from? Or like, why now? Like, what was the source of it? And there was a lot, but I can identify a huge, I want to say, growing awareness of what I felt like our work was going to move towards from this dream of being in a village and realizing that I had a crucial role in that. I was being, not metaphorically, but literally woken up to play my role, right? Like waking up, like, okay, it's initiation time. You're on. Here we are. And that name, One Village, right? The village piece came really from that dream, from these loose conversations, and ultimately from one of our young people who had been through the Rite, putting a stake in the ground and being like, I think this needs to happen now, and I'm willing to, I'm willing to put myself in the mix. Now is the time.
Wow, yeah, got goosebumps during your your dream thing. I love when dreams have that kind of impact,
Yeah.
Especially when they come back to us to make the message clear. And yeah, I'm curious what the village looks like now. Like what are the offerings, and for people out there who are interested.
Yep.
I mean, I know I'm interested, but yeah, are you doing camps through the summer? Are you doing and what does the village context look like for you?
Yeah. So I mentioned we just finished our parent-child camp. Starting in 2 weeks, we're running a big one for our one of our local elementary schools. So we'll be taking 110 fifth graders for 3 nights and create, like, we're really taking over a tradition of our community of sending them to camp, but we're bringing it home and doing it here on the island now and holding the ritual as part of our One Village offering and centering it around the gift, right? Our goal is not like, let's, sit around and do archery. And I love archery for one, but it's less about the activity and more about the quality of being seen and loved. So we get to do that in 2 weeks, which is just something I'm super excited about. Starting in June, we're running day camps for youth here on the island. But our kind of sequence that I like to say is more of the rites of passage focused stuff starts in July. We're doing our classic middle school camp. That one's for boys called Wayfinders. That's a 4-day rite of passage. It's held here on the island, and it's almost full. That one usually fills up because it's for middle school boys, and parents are just like, please take them. And it's fun. I was a camp lead for it last year. It's one of the most fun things we've ever done. And actually, ever since we've offered it, we realized like that model is slam dunk. If someone out there is like, hey, I'm curious about starting rites of passage, like what are the models that work? Like that model, hands down, I think will be effective almost anywhere. It's the right length, it's the right age, it's scalable within a kind of a anywhere from like 7 to 21 youth. And it works really well anywhere in there. And it's just super effective and powerful. That's in July. At the end of July, we're running our Teen Quest for boys and young men. That's for ages 16 to 20. That's a 10-day, I would say, familiar for folks who've done Vision Fast work. It's modeled, similar to a lot of those experiences where we go off to a remote site and there's solo time, deep inquiry, claiming statements, mirroring. It's amazingly beautiful and profound work that ever since we started, I think represents a lot of the best of what we do. And then what I'm most excited about this August, for the first time, we're running Origins, which is what we're calling a rite of belonging for teens of all genders. And the young person I just mentioned, their name is Alex. They're going to be one of our junior staff on it. We have women, non-binary folks. We have men, and really an age range that spans our youngest staff person, who will be 20, all the way up to like 60. We have one of our two of our elders from our elders council who will be staffing as well. So we have this huge range of age and stage, but also gender expression holding that container. And we're going to take about 10 older teens also out into the wilderness for a fasting solo experience. And I'm so stoked. I'm one of the guides on that, so I'm so excited to be back out there on the land with the young folks.
Hmm.
And yeah, that's our sequence. In addition to that, we do a lot of training. So like every spring we do rites of passage leadership training. And then we'll usually do another sequence in the fall of facilitator training and also rites of passage work. And I like to think that like for parents or educators or people who are just like, maybe you have a young one or maybe you don't, even older kid or don't even have kids, rites of passage methodology, particularly in the realm of like gift focused awareness and developing rites and activities around celebrating the gifts of people, this is applicable no matter like what you do. And I also like to say for people who are like, I don't know where to begin, I don't know, maybe they don't even know what they're missing or what the next step would be, doing an intro level training with us or a similar org, oftentimes like I'll see people participating and like a light will go off and they'll just be like, oh my gosh, okay, I got what I needed. And it might not be like the tools or the facilitation practice, but it might just be an awareness of like, now I know what I need and I know where I'm going to go to get it. Or now I know who I need to talk to when I go home so we can begin creating the structure that's available for our young people. And yeah, that's a pretty good set of what we got going on. I'm also super stoked too. I mentioned to you, I'm coming up to Canada, coming up to your hood next weekend to visit. We'll get to see Ian and be at this Martin Shaw event. We'll swing through and see your space too. And that's one of my favorite things too, is weaving, like you said, weaving this fabric of connection and community with folks who are engaged in such similar work, maybe in a slightly different bioregion, but ultimately, I think we're all aiming towards the same vision. And that's so fun.
Yeah, 100%. Man, you're doing it. You're really building village. I didn't realize to what extent. That's a lot. That's a lot, man. That's a lot of work and a lot of impact. And what I've learned through my own process of revillaging myself and my world is that it really starts at these really like atomic, local levels where like that's where the depth of the fabric weave can happen. And with Revillager, it's like we're trying to take those things that are already happening, these villages that are and organizations and communities that are really trying to do this, and then start to find the threads between them, and start to thread the kind of wider fabric, I suppose, which is why I think technology is useful in that sense, because the technology we have now has been able to connect us on wider levels than ever before. And my background is not technology. I never thought I was going to get into this tech startup world, but seeing the capability of connecting the threads of these various villages that, in my experience, has been like we're all reinventing the wheel separately. And it's like if we can figure out how to become the mycelial network that learns together, then that's going to be a game changer for our ability to actually create a new model for society. Because this experiment's been happening for 70 years, and a lot of it's been trial and error and failure. And I think right now we're in this really like incredible Cambrian explosion of possibility and connection. And that comes with a lot of shadow, and that comes with a lot of co-opting from other modes of systems and capitalism and all that. But at the same time, like what you're doing is so inspiring because those kids are going to grow up and be the next generation. And just that emphasis on building out into the generations, like that one. Hi.
This is my oldest. This is Maverick.
What's up, Maverick? Hi.
Speaking of the next generation.
Yeah, it's just it's so powerful. Like you said, like looking at how the kids are doing in the village is how you know how good the village is doing in our culture. And so kudos to you, man. That's a lot of work. and being a
I
dad
have
too.
a question. So, and I know we're close to time, but you said this has been happening for 70 years. And I'm like, when you
Yeah,
reference that, I'm like, what are you referring to? I'm really curious what arc you're referencing in that.
good question. Yeah, I think I mean the kind of revillaging movement.
Yes. Okay.
Just obviously village is hundreds of thousands of years old.
Yeah.
Uh, but what I speak to specifically is kind of the resurgence of how do we build tighter village communities in the Western world, which
Yeah.
in my understanding was kind of born in the 60s.
Yeah.
Um, so that's what I was referencing. But to be fair, people were doing it before that. It's just
Yeah.
it became a bit more of the mainstream, and there were so many examples of people like blowing up and going off in fireworks. And obviously, a
Yeah.
lot of people have a really stigmatized view of communities. I mean, we live in a small community. We're about 40 people on land together. And the amount of people that call us a commune or a cult just because we live together, like that's the framework of what mainstream culture thinks about villaging in
Hmm.
Western culture, anyways. Um, so that's something I'm just aware of, and even choosing the name Revillager, some people have problems with that,
Yeah.
and for various reasons, and they're valid. And at the same time, like village to me is so innate to humanity. It's pre-culture, pre-agricultural evolution, like revolution. It's so
Yeah.
deep. And the revillaging movement, and I don't think there is really a starting point for that. But this kind of I'm noticing a lot more people and a lot more conversation around how do we come back to local community,
Mm.
and a lot of people, how do we come back to food sovereignty,
Hmm.
and how do we come back to treating the planet in a good way. And I know that's a
Yeah.
big topic for kids these days.
Yeah.
um, at the same time, you have this emphasis to go deeper into the metaverse and go into this digital
Yeah.
digital space where it's infinite, whatever you want it to be. um, but at the same time, I'm like, part of Revillager is noticing the effect social media has had on culture, on our
Hmm.
kids, and where it's going, and trying to offer something in a different direction with laying on the same technology.
Hmm.
um yeah, so I hope that answers your question.
It does. Yeah. And yeah, that's helpful. Um, I, uh, I find myself curious about, you know, the idea that some people feel resistant to the word the name revillager. One of our goals in One Village at our mission statement, which is to cultivate, uh, or excuse me, to create cultures of belonging through transformational experiences and leadership training for youth and their people.
Mm,
And our goal was to create a name and a mission that was like universally yesable. Like
yeah.
who would ever read that and be like, I don't know. I don't know about that. And I guess that's kind of my response to Revillager. I'm like, what are you disagreeing with? Like, like, no, like we don't want to be connected or like thriving. Not into that. And I'm like, okay, got it. Maybe it's not for everybody, but I am playfully engaging with the like cult like nature of true community building because I've looked up the definition of cult probably a dozen times in the last year because I'm like, God, am I leading a cult? Like, I don't know. Like maybe I should get clear on this. And my answer is no. But if we can playfully engage in that with some levity, then it doesn't feel so like dark and ominous of like, ooh, like what are these people doing in their communes?
Yeah.
Because when we started, like you said, like a lot of these things start in these atom like little, pockets. When we started, even though I was literally born and raised in this community, like every ounce of my body is indigenous to this place, even if my culture and heritage is not. As soon as we started, people that I literally grew up with were like, well, that's kind of sketchy. You're trying to take, boys out into the woods. And I was like, really? Like, honestly, now, like that's coming up. And I have to say, like, that's the cultural shadow part that we have to be willing to work with. We have to be able to hold that. And for me, it's usually poking fun at it and playfully engaging of like, maybe it is a cult. You want to join? We got some really good Kool-Aid. And also diffusing that by being like, if it makes people feel better, like to recognize that villages, and I would say our organization and those like it, have a leadership structure that's transparent, that invites, that invites voices that are, historically are often unheard, that, cherishes and values diversity, and that, is an evolving structure. It's not a static hierarchy, right? And those are the things that I imagine are the bits of technology that I like to call social technology. That it's not digital, it's a social technological, tool and process that's teachable, that we can translate to other places and, ultimately pass on, that can help folks feel like they're not starting from scratch. Because a lot of the things that we did and we started with took a long time to build. And I don't want to pretend that, there's a whole bunch of shortcuts or that it doesn't need to take time. But I also think that some of what we've learned in the process would dramatically help other folks in, I want to say, experiencing ease in their versions of it. And I also feel like so curious around harvesting some of the tools and social technology of other thriving structures and villages, based on what they've learned and what they've inherited, from their elders and from their wisdom teachers. That's where I see your tool and what you've built. Like, that's the value that I'm probably most excited about, because the current tools and paradigms to me are really lacking in their ability to transfer that form of technology and really help people feel like, oh, cool, I actually have support in doing this. And I joke often with our staff and supporters. I'll go, hey guys, can I tell you a secret? Turns out culture change is really hard. Really hard, and we're gonna do it anyways. Like, I'm in 100%, but oh my gosh, like sometimes I just feel like, oh, there's resistance in so many different facets of this. And to know that there's other remnants of folks who are engaging in their versions of revillaging and have wisdom, and maybe even just like, I see you, like that form of support. Like, I'm in for that too. I need it.
100%. I mean, I'm glad you bring up that piece about social technology, because I bring that up to a lot of people who are very technophobic. They don't want anything to do with technology. And I'm like, well, what about your clothes? What about the tools you're using for your gardening? What about the house you live in? And also, what about village as a social technology? Maybe the most powerful social technology we've ever created, and which actually led us to becoming the dominant species of the world, is our ability to cooperate. Like, that was really it, and that gave us the edge. And rite of passage, also a social technology. Like, if we reframe technology as not just these artificial plastic metal pieces, but actually things that we've created to improve life. The social technologies are huge. And to your point, like, I think that we all need to kind of figure out how to learn from each other, and I think there's just this emphasis on culture war and taking each other down and just criticizing the heck out of everything. And it's like, if anything, we need to remember how to be pro-social and cooperate and collaborate and not tear each other down. We're all imperfect. We're all going to make mistakes, and I think with village, like, a lot of people are like, oh, village is in the past. So that's like one thing I get a lot. Like, how is village modern? And it's like, well, both of us are bringing it into the modern world. Like, this is actually a really important part of the modern world. And second of all, people will be like, well, what do you know about village? And it's like, yeah, fair enough. Like, I'm a white man who didn't grow up in a village. I get it. I get that criticism. And like, why wouldn't I try? Why wouldn't I try and offer, if anything else, a platform for creating your own version of village and your own culture? And the root of culture is cult. You know what I mean? Like, we have this
same word,
cult, but it's, every religion started as a cult. And Jamie Wheel has this great bit in his last book about ethical cult building. And essentially, one of the things he speaks about is open sourcing, which is what you're doing. Like, it's not going to be a he calls them culty cults. It's not a culty cult. It's like we're trying to like offer this to the people and make it accessible, and there's no like intense hierarchy. And yeah, like we're all gonna have our different perspectives, and being in the body I'm gonna have certain judgments and projections placed on me, and I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
And we all need to try and do what's alive in our hearts, and do it to the best we can, and be open to feedback and be open to criticism, but not let that stop us from giving our gift. And what I've learned, the most humbling thing I've learned, is that all of this work I'm doing, I'm probably not going to see the fruits of it in the way that I want it to be. So what I'm doing right now, revillaging, is really for the future generations. And I'm hopefully my prayer is that, we'll take a step, and then they have a step forwards, and we'll stand on the shoulders of our ancestors, and they'll stand on ours. And yeah.
Well, I will be there with you, Jasper, planting trees whose shade I won't know. And that to me is, I think that's part of I'll say an indigenous way of being to the earth that I'm relearning as a white person born of, all forms of colonialism, but that's true in my bones of just being like, when I can engage in that form of relating with myself and my role and place here, that feels both relieving, because there's not the sense of like, oh, I'm just never going to be done.
Yeah.
I'm okay. That's helpful. But the other part is like, when I'm engaging with these young folks, whether they're my kids or other youth I work with, like I get to be in the joy of that medicine and imagine like, man, someday I'm going to be an elder at this fire, and you're going to be running this process. And I'm just going to be sitting there like, yes, it was worth it. You know what I mean? Like, and then I'm going to die, and I'm going to go back to the earth, and, maybe 70 years later, that kid will be an elder watching that same process unfold, feeling like, yes, it was worth it. And that form of village, right? That long play vision and the willingness to be in the impossible work, because we know in our hearts and deep in us, like that it's the right thing to do. And that's what we're here for. I'm good with that. And I appreciate the importance of recognizing that, we also set ourselves up for projection and for, I'll say the calls to smallness, and to not be in a spotlight, or to not be in a leadership role, or really in a centerpiece of it all. And I like to say, it's so important to listen to everything, but ultimately only take in what's ours. And that is a journey in itself. But I think that form of humility and the willingness to have these conversations, and also conversations with people who are really questioning, those are really important. And I've grown and learned so much in those conversations myself, and oftentimes feel reoriented in it. But not, I want to say not unmotivated, like not uninspired to stay the course. And I think that's because we've created a village here. I think without that sense of like our elders council, our youth leaders, our staff who are so amazing and just have so much beauty and wisdom and life experience, like without that, I would have folded so many times in this journey. And I have to credit my team and all of my people, my wife, my kids. Like, I'm going to go play some lacrosse here with my oldest here in a moment. He's beckoning for my attention.
Yeah. No.
But yeah, like gratitude, right? Gratitude for you for inviting this conversation, gratitude to the village that we're building and creating here, and also for the vision, right? The vision to begin to weave these things in a modern construct, and to trust that it's so needed right now.
Yeah, man. I feel that. Well, thank you so much for sharing and connecting. This was an awesome conversation. I'm sure we could go for a lot longer, but families and such
Yeah.
need our attention too.
Yes.
So I just want to point people to Journeyman. Go check it out. I'll put the links down below.
Cool.
One Village as well. And also our Kickstarter. We have 4 days left and we're ending on Mother's Day. That was no coincidence.
Oh, that's so cool.
Which is also my mom's birthday. So it's a big day. It's this Sunday. So if you haven't checked out our Kickstarter, please do and help us out, donate, share. We're almost at our goal, but we need help to get there.
How much is left in the goal? Do you know?
I think we have 11% left. So about
11%.
$3,000.
Oh, we got this.
Yeah, we got
Let's go,
this.
people.
I'm
3K.
confident, but we still need you.
Yes.
Sweet. Well, thanks so much, Nicky, and have an awesome time with your son. And I will connect with you soon, I'm sure.
Hope to see you next weekend. And yeah, I'm bringing the family up too. So hoping we get to weave for a moment. It sounds nice.
Perfect.
All right, brother. Be well.
Awesome. Thank you.
Cheers.